chat on here. Okay. Jesse's in the house. All right, if I can read the chat, you guys can probably hear me. And I told you guys, I picked up another copy of this book a while back. I said when I got a chance, I would read from it. If you've never read this book before, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, this is the abridged version. The book came out in '99, and the original book is huge. It's like my first book, Letters and Numbers. It's nearly 800 pages long. This is the tightened up version. And just a reminder about loaning out things. I used to have the original version back in the day. I've lost so many books from loaning them out to people over the years. This book's no longer in print. This cost me $250. This is what I got for my birthday for myself. The abridged version of this. You really can't find it for cheaper than 250 bucks. But this was my birthday present to me this year. And, you know, time's flown by. And I said I would read it some months ago. And we're not going to read it all today because it's a big old book. But you know what? We'll read it bit by bit, piece by piece. I'm going to skip the foreword, and I'm just going to jump right into the preface. Again, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. Charlotte Iserbyt is the author, and it begins with the preface. Coexistence on this tightly knit earth should be viewed as an existence not only without wars, but also without the government telling us how to live, what to say, what to think, what to know, and what not to know. What a quote, right? You'd never believe the date of this quote. Shout out to the super chatter. I will read super chats later because we are going to do a Sunday night stream a little bit later today. But this quote is from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, from the date September 11th, 1973. And I got to read it one more time. Coexistence on this tightly knit earth should be viewed as an existence not only without wars, but also without the government telling us how to live, what to say, what to think, what to know, and what not to know. Unfortunately, that's exactly how it is, though. Just the opposite. And then he's got a quote from, or she's got a quote here from Aristotle as well. Educated men are as much superior to uneducated men as the living are to the dead. And again, you have to understand, in America, we might call it education, but people aren't getting educated in America. They are not getting educated. They are getting indoctrinated with the things the government wants them to know. So then we continue. The United States is engaged in a war. People write important books about war. Books documenting the battles fought, the names of the generals involved, the names of those who fired the first shot. This book is simply a history book about another kind of war. One fought using psychological methods. A 100-year war. A different, more deadly war than any in which our country has ever been involved. A war about which the average American hasn't the foggiest idea. And we know that's still true. This is from 1999, but we know that's still true because we saw the people going out with their slave muzzles on. You know, then Fauci said put on 2 slave muzzles, and some people had 2 muzzles here, a third one here with the plastic over, and then they were going around with a bandage on their arm because they became a Pfizer guinea pig. These people didn't have the foggiest idea. The reason Americans do not understand this war is because it has been fought in secret in the schools of our nation, targeting our children who are captive in classrooms. Think about who got the worst of the pandemic. Think who's getting the worst of everything right now. It is the children in the classrooms. This is why once upon a time I decided to become a teacher so I could, for a small group of children who'd end up in my room, be something different than what most children experience in classrooms. And the time I was a teacher, I did just that. And you know why they didn't want me in the school? Because I did just that. because I wasn't going along with the game plan of indoctrination and helping churn out little dummies. The wagers of this war are using very sophisticated and effective tools. The Hegelian dialectic, we're very familiar with that term around here. Common ground, consensus, and compromise. Gradualism, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. Semantic deception, redefining terms to get agreement without understanding. The Hegelian dialectic is a process formulated by the German philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. By the way, he lived from 1770 to 1831. And used by Karl Marx, of course that's Mr. Communism, and codifying revolutionary communism as a dialectical materialism. As Sam Blumenfeld pointed out, Hegel believed that the state was God walking on earth, the evidence of which can be found in his dialectic. This process can be illustrated, so I think it's going to be hard for me to show you the illustration, but we have 3 lines intersecting at a point, okay? One line is labeled thesis, the other line is labeled antithesis, and the other line pointing downwards is labeled synthesis or consensus. The thesis represents either an established practice or point of view which is pitted against the antithesis, usually a crisis of opposition fabricated or created by change agents, causing the thesis to compromise itself, incorporating some part of the antithesis to produce the synthesis, sometimes called the consensus. This is the primary tool in the bag of tricks used by change agents who are trained to direct this process all over the country, much like the in-service training I received. A good example of this concept was voiced by T.H. Bell when he was U.S. Secretary of Education. He said, "We need to create a crisis to get consensus in order to bring about change." The reader might be reminded that it was under T.H. Bell's direction that the U.S. Department of Education implemented the changes suggested by a nation at risk, the alarm that was sounded in the early 1980s to announce the crisis in education. And again, this whole thing factors in with what Rahm Emanuel once said, never let a good crisis go to waste. It factors into the motto of the Jesuits and the Masons, order out of chaos. Create the problem, provide the solution. You got the cooties. We got a cooties problem, so you better go get jabbed up. Pfizer needs record profits. Since we have been, as a nation, so relentlessly exposed to this Hegelian dialectical process, which is essential to the smooth operation of the system, under the guise of reaching consensus in our involvement in parent-teacher organizations, on school boards and legislature, and even in goal setting in community service organizations and groups, including our churches, I want to explain clearly how it works in a practical application. A good example with which most of us can identify involves property taxes for local schools. Let us consider an example from Michigan. The internationalist change agents must abolish local control, the thesis, in order to restructure our schools from academics to global workforce training, the synthesis. Funding of education with the property tax allows local control, but it also enables the change agents and teachers unions to create higher and higher school budgets paid for with higher taxes, thus infuriating homeowners. In the time I lived in Yakima, you guys, my property taxes started out at just under $2,000 a year. Then they decided to build a bunch of new schools, and my property taxes climbed to nearly $5,000 a year, and they will continue to go up. I'm sure had I stayed in Yakima, I would have been paying over $5,000 this year, but just think about that. And what was comical for me is when I first moved to Yakima, I was hired to teach in the district only to get a letter to rescind the offer, letting them know that they could not hire me, and they would not tell me why at first, but of course they eventually told me, and it was because of my first book, Letters and Numbers. And remember, the same day I had that meeting and got that answer, which was August 21st, 18, later that day I had the FBI show up at my house and falsely accuse me of saying something I never said. Again, they don't want people like me in the classrooms. I might read this to the students. Hold on. Here we go. Eventually, property owners accept the change agent's radical proposal, the antithesis, to reduce their property taxes by transferring education funding from the local property tax to the state income tax. Thus, the change agents accomplish their ultimate goal, the transfer of funding of education from the local level to the state level. When this transfer occurs, it increases state-federal control and funding, leading to the federal internationalist goal of implementing global workforce training through the schools, the synthesis. And again, essentially what it really is the homeowners end up paying way more in taxes, and they still have the federal and state control. So, but I do understand the point she's making, and I'm sure those tactics have been used all over. Regarding the power of gradualism, remember the story of the frog and how he didn't save himself because he didn't realize what was happening to him. He was thrown into cold water, which in turn was gradually heated up until finally it reached the boiling point and he was dead. This is how gradualism works, through a series of created crises which utilize Hegel's dialectical process, leading us to a more radical change when we would otherwise not accept. In the instance of semantic deception, do you remember your kindly principal telling you that the new decision-making program would help your child make better decisions? What good parent wouldn't want his or her own child to learn how to make good decisions? Did you know that the decision-making program is the same controversial values clarification program recently rejected by your school board, and against which you may have given repeated testimony? As I've said before, the wagers of this intellectual social war have employed very effective weapons to implement their changes. This war has, in fact, become the war to end all wars. If citizens on this planet can be brainwashed or robotized using dumbed-down Pavlovian, Skinnerian education, I remember learning about Pavlov's dog and Skinner and the way they trained the responses. To accept what those in control want, there will be no more wars. If there are no rights or wrongs, there will be no one wanting to right a wrong. Robots have no conscience. The only permissible conscience will be the United Nations or a global conscience. Whether an action is good or bad will be decided by a global government's global conscience, as recommended by Dr. Brock Chisholm, Executive Secretary of the World Health Organization, Interim Commission in 1947, and later in 1996 by current United States Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. You may protest, but no one has died in this war. Is that the only criteria we have with which to measure whether war is war? Didn't Aristotle say it well when he said, educated men are as much superior to uneducated men as the living are to the dead? To withhold the tools of education can kill a person's spirit just as surely as a bullet to his body. The tragedy is that many Americans have died in other wars to protect the freedoms being taken away in this one. This war, which produces the death of intellect and freedom, is not waged by a foreign enemy, but by the silent enemy in the ivory towers in our own government, and in tax-exempt foundations, the enemy whose every move I have tried to document in this book, usually in his, her, its own words. For over a 25-year period, the research used in this chronology has been collected from many sources: the United States Department of Education, international agencies, state agencies, the media, concerned educators, parents, legislators, and talented researchers, with whom I have worked. In the process of gathering this information, two beliefs that most Americans hold in common became clear. One, if a child can read, write, and compute at a reasonably proficient level, he will be able to do just about anything he wishes, enabling him to control his destiny to the extent that God allows. Two, providing such basic educational proficiencies is not and should not be an expensive proposition. Since most Americans believe the second premise, that providing basic educational proficiencies is not and should not be an expensive proposition, it becomes obvious that it is only a radical agenda, the purpose of which is to change values and attitudes, brainwash. That is the costly agenda. In other words, brainwashing by our schools and universities is what is bankrupting our nation and our children's minds. This was written in 1999. Think about how much worse it has become since 1999. A lot worse. This book or collection of research in book form was put together primarily to satisfy my own need to see the various components which led to the dumbing down of the United States of America assembled in chronological order in writing. Even I, who had observed these weird activities taking place at all levels of government, was reluctant to accept a malicious intent behind each individual chronological activity or innovation unless I could connect it with other similar activities taking place at other times. This book, which makes such connections, has provided for me a much-needed sense of closure. The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America is also a book for my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. I want them to know that there were thousands of Americans who may not have died or been shot in overseas wars, but were shot at in small-town wars, at school board meetings, at state legislative hearings on education, and most importantly in the media. I want my progeny to know that whatever intellectual and spiritual freedoms to which they may still lay claim were fought for are a result of the courageous work of incredible people who dared tell the truth against all odds. I want them to know that there will always be hope for freedom if they follow in these people's footsteps. If they cherish the concept of free will, if they believe that human beings are special, not animals, and that they have intellects, souls, and consciences. I want them to know that if the government schools are allowed to teach children K through 12 using Pavlovian, Skinnerian animal training methods, which provide tangible rewards only for correct answers, there can be no freedom. Just like I said, go to school. What's the correct answer? Who discovered America? Was it Where's Waldo? Was it Mickey Mouse? Was it Christopher Columbus? Was it Adolf Hitler? Oh, you knew it was Christopher Columbus? A+, you're going places, Johnny. Again, that's all the American education is. Which one of the bullshit answers do you know to circle to get the correct answer in this classroom? Again, the right answer was none of the above, because how could Christopher Columbus discover a land where people already lived? This used to drive me nuts when I was a child. I had to learn about Christopher Columbus every year, the Titanic every year, which seemed like a load. Every year they were teaching us the same loads in every grade level. You finally get out of high school and you think you're going to learn something new in college, and oh my God, the first lesson in college is who discovered America. It's like, do we learn anything at any level? When does this end? Why people trained, not educated, by such educational techniques will be fearful of taking principled, sometimes controversial stands when called for, because these people will have been programmed to speak up only if a positive reward or response is forthcoming. The price of freedom has often been paid with pain and loneliness. Does that sound familiar, truth seeker? Have you tried to tell somebody the truth only to be demonized? Have you found yourself being abandoned by your friends for speaking up? Have you found that you can't do your job that you paid a whole bunch of money to go to school for because you wrote a book exposing some knowledge that just wasn't supposed to be out there? Just as Barbara Tuchman or another historian would do in writing the history of the other kinds of wars, I have identified chronologically the major battles, players, dates, and places. I know that researchers and writers with far more talent than I will feel that I have neglected some key events in this war. I stand guilty on all accounts, even before there were well-researched charges are submitted. Even before their well-researched charges are submitted. Yes, much of importance has been left out due to space limitations, but the overview of the battlefields and maneuvers will give the reader an opportunity to glimpse the immensity of this conflict. In order to win a battle, one must know who the real enemy is. That's some art of war right there. Know your enemy. Otherwise, one is shooting in the dark and often hitting those not the least bit responsible for the mayhem. This book hopefully identifies the real enemy and provides Americans involved in this war, be they plain ordinary citizens, elected officials, or traditional teachers, with the ammunition to fight to obtain victory. Okay. She does have acknowledgments, and, shout out to all these people. But again, I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of the book. It is expensive, but you can probably find it in your library. Probably. We do live in the censorship age, but if you want to read all the acknowledgments, they are in here. She lists a lot of names. I'm sure they all deserve to be read, but we're going to skip it for right now. Introduction. I find it funny the year she started with. In the fall of 1972. That's where we start. In the fall of 1972. Of course, you're going back to school, typically end of summer, start of fall. But 72, you guys, interesting year she chose. School in Gematria 72, just like Jesuit order. And as we know who's really controlling his story books. All roads do lead to Rome, and then, of course, after Rome, they go back to Egypt and Africa, and then they go right back to Babylon. But anyway, in the fall of 1972, a small group of students in an introduction to educational psychology class at a Midwestern university saved every single soul in the lifeboat. The professor became agitated. He said, "No, go back and do the exercise again. Follow the instructions." The students, products of the radical 1960s culture, expected this to be a small group assignment in creativity and ingenuity. They had worked out an intricate plan whereby everyone in the lifeboat could survive. When the professor persisted, the students resisted and ultimately refused to do the exercise. Chalk up a victory to the human spirit. However, it was a short-lived victory. This overloaded lifeboat in crisis represented a dramatic shift in education. The exercise in which students were compelled to choose which humans were expendable and therefore should be cast off into the water became a mainstay in classrooms across the country. Creative solutions, not allowed. Instructions, strictly adhered to. In truth, there is to be only one correct answer to the lifeboat drama: death. Publication of The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America is certain to add fuel to the fire in this nation's phonics war. Ever since publications of her first work, Back to Basics Reform, or OBE Skinnerian International Curriculum 1985, Iserbit has been trumpeting the fact that the it's so hard to say it like that, Skinnerian, again, she's talking about the psychologist Skinner. The Skinner method, we'll just say, applied in the Exemplary Center for Reading Instruction, is the very same method. And as I do read this and stumble over things like that, remember, I am also a product of the deliberate dumbing down of America. But is the very same method applied in Siegfried Engelmann's DISTAR, which stands for Direct Instruction System for Teaching and Remediation, now known as Reading Mastery. In her latest work, Iserbit provides exhaustive documentation that direct instruction, aka systematic intensive phonics, which is being institutionalized nationally under the guise of traditional phonics thanks to the passage of the Reading Excellence Act of 1998, relies on the Skinner method to teach reading. From now on, we will just call it the Skinner method because I can say that very easily, thanks to my dumbed down state. Anyhow, Charlotte Iserbyt is the consummate whistleblower. The writer describes her own... Actually, I'm going to skip this part too because it's praising her. Let's get right down to it. It begins. From the noxious 90s through the terrible 2s. And then it's also subcaptioned, you know it's true when it happens to you. So here we go. Actually, we can... hold on. Hold on. I'm debating on if I want to read this part because they added this part on to this new abridged version. I think I just want to jump to her original writing in the original book. So we'll do it like this. Chapter 1, The Sowing of the Seeds. Late 18th and 19th centuries. That last chapter was about No Child Left Behind, which was going on at the time that it was republished. So, and again, for people who forgot what No Child Left Behind was, it happened in the time Bush was president, and it was one of those Orwellian terms. More children were left behind than ever. I was teaching in the time of No Child Left Behind. Part of what happened, here, before I even read this, for people who don't know, No Child Left Behind, everyone should know this. So it really targeted poor communities for destruction because these are already the most suffering schools. And there's a lot of reasons they are. Low parent involvement, a lot of parents missing from the household. You'll find more people that, parents that don't even speak English, first generation Americans, learning English, all sorts of obstacles in poorer neighborhoods. And what No Child Left Behind did is if a school was not meeting its benchmarks for testing, then it lost funding. So imagine being a school in a poor district that's already understaffed, already struggling, and then not meeting your benchmarks, so you lose funding. So now there's less after-school programs for tutoring. There's just less resources for everything, less resources for teacher assistants. If you continue to not meet your benchmarks, you lose even more funding. And then what happens is if you continue to not meet the benchmarks, they shut down the school, but do they build new schools in the poor community? No. So now what happens is one of the schools goes down. So now where do all those students go? Well, they go to the closest schools nearby, which are already suffering. So now those classrooms have even bigger student populations, and they're likely already in the same process of losing resources. See how this works? No Child Left Behind. Okay, the sowing of the seeds. The sowing of the seeds, late 18th and 19th centuries, is the shortest chapter of the deliberate dumbing down of America. Undoubtedly, this chapter may be one of the most important since the philosophies of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Wilhelm Wundt, and John Dewey et al. Reflect a total departure from the traditional definition of education like the one given in the New Century Dictionary of the English Language. The drawing out of a person's innate talents and abilities by imparting the knowledge of languages, scientific reasoning, history, literature, rhetoric, etc., the channels through which those abilities would flourish and serve. A quantum leap was taken from the above definition to the new, dehumanizing definition used by the experimental psychologists found in an outline of educational psychology. Learning is the result of modifiability in the paths of neural conduction. Explanations of even such forms of learning as abstraction and generalization demand of the neurons only growth, excitability, conductivity, and modifiability. The mind is the connection system of man, and learning is the process of connecting. The situation. She has some typos in it. This version, I don't remember the original version had as many typos. The situation response formula is adequate to cover learning of any sort, and the really influential factors in learning are readiness of the neuron sequence in time, belongingness, and satisfying consequences. She's probably also the product of the deliberate dumbing down of America. I don't think you can escape it in this society. The chemicals, the poison, the programming, the horrible schools. Again, you guys think about it. The highest paid position in America is an actor. One of the lowest paid positions in America is a teacher. I don't think there's a lower paid position with less income growth than a teacher in America. You know, average teacher, you know, they spend all this money on education. They get out. I think even still today, probably the average wage for a teacher coming out of college is $40,000. Not very good. An in-depth understanding, I mean, you can make more by pushing carts at Costco. An in-depth understanding of the deplorable situation found in our nation's schools today is impossible without an understanding of the redefinition in the above statements. Education in the 21st century will, for the majority of youth, be workforce training. Thus, the need for Pavlovian and Skinnerian methodology based on operant conditioning, which in essence is at the heart of the above dehumanizing definition of education. This sowing of the seeds through redefinition will reap the death of traditional liberal arts education through the advent of mastery learning, outcome-based education, and direct instruction, all of which will be performance-based and behaviorist. In 1762, Mr. Rousseau wrote The Social Contract, presented in Emile influenced the French Revolution. In this book, Rousseau promoted child-centered permissive education in which a teacher should avoid strict discipline and tiresome lessons. Wow. I'll tell you what, that was in 1762. That was clearly missed in my upbringing because there was strict discipline and very, very tiresome lessons. Both Rousseau and Swiss educator Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi believed that the whole child should be educated by doing, and that religion should not be a guiding principle in education, a theme we shall see repeated over the next 238 years. Wilhelm Wundt, founder of experimental psychology in 1832, and the force behind its dissemination throughout the Western world, was born in 1832. The following excerpts concerning Wundt's contribution to modern education are taken from the Leipzig Connection, the Systematic Destruction of American Education, written by an author from Portland, Oregon. How about that? It was written 3 years before I was born. I'm also from Portland. To Wundt, a thing made sense and was worth pursuing if it could be measured, quantified, and scientifically demonstrated. Seeing no way to do this with the human soul, he proposed that psychology concern itself solely with experience. As Wundt put it, Karl Marx injected Hegel's theories with economics and sociology, developing a philosophy of dialectical materialism. From Wundt's work, it was only a short step to the latter redefinition of education. Originally, education meant drawing out of a person's innate talents and abilities by imparting the knowledge of languages, scientific reasoning, history, literature, rhetoric, etc., the channels through which those abilities would flourish and serve. To the experimental psychologist, however, education became the process of exposing the student to meaningful experiences so as to ensure desired reactions. Learning is the result of modifiability in the paths of neural conduction. Explanations of even such forms of learning as abstraction and generalization demand of the neurons only growth, excitability, conductivity, and modifiability. The mind is the connection system of man, and learning is the process of connecting. Now, I know they just wrote that on the other page, too. The situation response formula is adequate to cover learning of any sort, and the really influential factors in learning are readiness of the neurons, sequence and time, belongingness, and satisfying consequences. If one assumes, as did Wundt, that there is nothing there to begin with but a body, a brain, a nervous system, then one must try to educate by inducing sensations in that nervous system. Through these experiences, the individual will learn to respond to any given stimulus with the correct response. The child is not, for example, thought capable of volitional control over his actions, or of deciding whether he will act or not act in a certain way. His actions are thought to be preconditioned and beyond his control. He is a stimulus response mechanism. According to this thinking, he is reactions. Wundt's thesis laid the philosophical basis for the principles of conditioning later developed by Pavlov, who studied physiology in Leipzig in 1884, 5 years after Wundt had inaugurated his laboratory there, and American behavioral psychologists such as Watson and Skinner for laboratories and electroconvulsive therapy for schools oriented more towards socialization of the child than toward the development of intellect, and for the emergence of a society more and more blatantly devoted to the gratification of sensory desire at the expense of responsibility and achievement. Note, the reader should purchase The Leipzig Connection, The Systematic Destruction of American Education, a slim paperback book which, in the writer's opinion, is the most useful and important book available regarding the method used to change children's behavior, values, and to dumb down an entire society. Again, for anybody who wants to look up that, The Leipzig Connection, The Systematic Destruction of American Education. The authors Liony and Klass have made an outstanding contribution to the history of American education and to the understanding of why and how America, which up until the 1930s had the finest education system in the world, ended up with one of the worst education systems in the industrialized world in a short period of 50 years. Another commentary on the importance of Wundt's theories comes from Dennis L. Cuddy, PhD, in an excellent article entitled The Conditioning of America, dated December 11th, 1989, in the Christian News out of New Haven, Missouri. An excerpt follows. The conditioning of modern American society begins with John Dewey, a psychologist, a Fabian socialist. Remember, Orwell was a member of the Fabian Society, and the father of progressive education. Dewey used the psychology developed in Leipzig by Wilhelm Wundt and believed that through a stimulus-response approach like Pavlov, students could be conditioned for a new social order. 1862. The first experiment with outcome-based education was conducted in England in 1862. So many good things come out of England, doesn't it? Do you guys remember when I made the video with the Queen's face and I was playing the song Cutie Pie, reminding that her demise was near? She just reminds me of good things out of England. Teacher opposition resulted in abandonment of the experiment. Don Martin of University of Pittsburgh, George E. Overholt, and Wayne J. Urban of Georgia State University wrote Accountability in American Education, a Critique in 1966, containing a section entitled Payment for Results, which chronicles the English experiment. The following excerpt outlines the experiment. The call for sound and cheap elementary instruction was answered by legislation passed by Parliament during 1862, known as the Revised Code. This was the legislation that produced payments for results, the 19th century English accountability system. The opposition to the English payment for results system, which arose at the time of its introduction, was particularly interesting. Teachers provided the bulk of the resistance, and they based their objections on both educational and economic grounds. They abhorred the narrowness and mechanical character the system imposed on the educational process. They also objected to the economic burden forced upon them by basing their pay on student performance. Payment for results and outcome-based education are based on teacher accountability and require teaching to the test, the result of which are to be measured for accountability purposes. And that's what we have now, teaching to the test, which is not real education. Both methods of teaching result in a narrow mechanic system of education similar in mastery learning. Teachers in the United States in 1999, as were teachers involved in the experiment in England, will be judged and paid according to student test scores, i.e., how well the teachers teach to the test. Proponents of mastery learning believe that almost all children can learn if given enough time, adequate resources geared to the individual learning style of the student, and a curriculum aligned to test items. Teach to the test mastery learning using Skinnerian methodology, operant conditioning in order to obtain predictable results. Benjamin Bloom, the father of mastery learning, says that the purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students. Mastery learning and its fraternal twin, direct instruction, are key components of outcome-based education and effective schools research. The one common thread running through this book relates to these terms and their importance in the implementation of workforce training and attitude and value change. 1874, 12 years later. Edward Lee Thorndike was born August 31st, 1874 in Williamsburg, Massachusetts. Thorndike was trained in the new psychology by the first generation of Wilhelm Wundt's proteges. He graduated from Wesleyan University in 1895 after having studied with Wundtians, Andrew C. Armstrong, and Charles Judd. He went to graduate school at Harvard and studied under psychologist William James. While at Harvard, Thorndike surprised James by doing research with chickens, testing their behavior, and pioneering what later became known as animal psychology. As briefly stated by Thorndike himself, psychology was the science of the intellect, character, and behavior of animals, including man. To further excerpt the Leipzig's connection's excellent treatment of Thorndike's background, Thorndike applied for a fellowship at Columbia, was accepted by Cattell, and moved with his two most intelligent chickens to New York, where he continued his research and earned his Ph.D. in 1893. Thorndike's specialty was the puzzle box, into which he would put various animals, chickens, rats, cats, and let them find their way out by themselves. His doctoral dissertation on cats has become part of the classical literature of psychology. After receiving his doctorate, he spent a year as a teacher at Western Reserve University, and it wasn't long before Cattell advised Dean Russell to visit Thorndike's first classroom at Western Reserve. Although the dean found him dealing with the investigation of mice and monkeys, he came away satisfied that he was worth trying out on humans. Russell offered Thorndike a job at Teachers College, where the experimenter remained for the next 30 years. Thorndike was the first psychologist to study animal behavior in an experimental psychology laboratory, and following Cattell's suggestion. Applying the same techniques to children and youth as one result in 1903, he published the book Educational Psychology. In the following years, he published a total of 507 books, monographs, and articles. Thorndike's primary assumption was the same as Wundt's. The man is an animal, that his actions are actually always reactions, and that he can be studied in the laboratory in much the same way as an animal might be studied. Thorndike equated children with the rats, monkeys, fish, cats, and chickens upon which he experimented in his laboratory and was prepared to apply what he found there to learning in the classroom. He extrapolated laws from his research into animal behavior, which he then applied to the training of teachers, who took what they had learned to every corner of the United States and ran their classrooms, curricula, and schools on the basis of his new educational psychology. Nice to know that our foundation is in, conditioning the behaviors of animals. And we know who thinks of most humans as animals. In the Principles of Teaching Based on Psychology from 1906, Thorndike proposed making the study of teaching scientific and practical. Thorndike's definition of the art of teaching is the art of giving and withholding stimuli with the result of producing or preventing certain responses. In this definition, the term stimulus is used widely for any event which influences a person, for a word spoken to him, a look, a sentence which he reads, the air he breathes, etc., etc. The term response is used for any reaction made by him, a new thought, a feeling of interest, a bodily act, any mental or bodily condition resulting from the stimulus. The aim of the teacher is to produce desirable and prevent undesirable changes in human beings by producing and preventing certain responses. The means at the disposal of the teacher are the stimuli which can be brought to bear upon the pupil, the teacher's words, gestures, and appearance, the condition and appliances of the schoolroom, the books to be used and objects to be seen, and so on, through a long list of things and events which the teacher can control. 1896. Psychology by John Dewey, the father of progressive education, was published out of the University of Chicago. This was the first American textbook on the revised subject of education. Psychology would become the most widely read and quoted textbook used in schools of education in this country. Just prior to the publication of his landmark book, Dewey had joined the faculty of the Rockefeller Endowed University of Chicago as head of the combined departments of philosophy, psychology, and pedagogy, which is teaching. In that same year, 1895, the university allocated $1,000 to establish a laboratory in which Dewey could apply psychology, principles, and experimental techniques to the study of learning. The laboratory opened in January 1896 as the Dewey School, later to become known as the University of Chicago Laboratory School. Dewey thought of the school as a place where his theories of education could be put into practice, tested, and scientifically evaluated. Dewey sought to apply the doctrines of experience and experiment to everyday life and hence to education, seeking via this model institution to pave the way for the schools of the future. There he had put into actual practice three of the revolutionary beliefs he had culled from the new psychology: that to put the child in possession of his fullest talents, education should be active rather than passive; that to prepare the child for a democratic society, the school should be social rather than individualistic; and that to enable the child to think creatively, experimentation rather than imitation should be encouraged. Samuel Blumenfeld, in his book The Whole Language and the OBE Fraud, was published in 96 in Boise, Idaho. Dewey further explains his perspective. What kind of curriculum would fit the school that was a mini cooperative society? Dewey's recommendation was indeed radical. Build the curriculum not around academic subjects, but around occupational activities which provided maximum opportunities for peer interaction and socialization. Since the beginning of Western civilization, the school curriculum was centered around the development of academic skills. The intellectual faculties, literacy produced, I skipped a line. The intellectual faculties and high literacy. Dewey wanted to change all of that. Why? Because high literacy produced that abominable form of independent intelligence, which was basically, as Dewey believed, antisocial. Thus, from Dewey's point of view, the school's primary commitment to literacy was indeed the key to the whole problem. In 1898, Dewey wrote an essay, The Primary Education Fetish, in which he explained exactly what he meant. There is a false education god whose idolaters are legion, and whose cult influences the entire educational system. This is language study, the study not of foreign language, but of English, not in a higher, but in primary education. It is almost an unquestioned assumption of educational theory and practice both that the first 3 years of a child's school life shall be mainly taken up with learning to read and write his own language. If we add to this the learning of a certain amount of numerical combinations, we have the pivot about which primary education swings. It does not follow, however, that conditions, social, industrial, and intellectual, have undergone such a radical change, that the time has come for a thorough examination of the emphasis put upon linguistic work and elementary instruction. The plea for the predominance of learning to read in early school life because of the great importance attaching literature seems to me a perversion. Interesting. So I realize what's going on with this abridged version. So they took excerpts from the original book, and then the person who did the abridged version, they like inserted their own little, bridges, if you will, between what was taken out. And that's why it seems kind of clunky in places. Yeah. I wish I still had the original version of the book. I used to have it. All right, so we're on to chapter 2. Let's see. Let me see. All right, we'll read chapter 2, and then I got to call my dad back. Okay, the turning of the tides, early 20th century, chapter 2. For a nation that had been able to point with pride to extraordinary advances in all areas of endeavor carried out by individuals with no assistance whatsoever from the government, the early years of the 20th century surely reflected a turning of the tides. An alien collectivist socialist philosophy, much of which came from Europe, crashed onto the shores of our nation, bringing with it radical changes in economics, politics, and education, funded surprisingly enough by several wealthy American families and their tax-exempt foundations. You know she's talking about the Rockefellers. They're the ones that kind of created this whole model and had a lot of influence on our books and industry and the world of pharmaceuticals and so many other things. The goal of these wealthy families and their foundations, a seamless, non-competitive global system for commerce and trade, when stripped of flowery expressions of concerns for minorities, the less fortunate, etc., represented the initial stage of what this author now refers to as the deliberate dumbing down of America. 70 years later, the carefully laid plans to change America from a sovereign constitutional republic with a free enterprise economic base to just one of many nations in an international socialist system, New World Order, she puts it right there in parentheses, are apparent. Only a dumbed-down population with no memory of America's roots as a prideful nation could be expected to willingly succumb to the global workforce training planned by the Carnegie Corporation and the John D. Rockefellers. 1 and 2. In the early 20th century, which is being implemented by the United States Congress in the year 1999 under Slick Willie. 1902, the General Education Board was incorporated by an act of the United States Congress approved January 12, 1902. The General Education Board was endowed by Mr. John D. Rockefeller, Sr. for the purpose of establishing an educational laboratory to experiment with early innovations in education. 1905, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching was founded in 1905. Henry S. Pritchett served as the foundation's first president. Pritchett was the author of What is Religion and Other Student Questions. 1913, John D. Rockefeller, Jr.'s director of charity for the Rockefeller Foundation, Frederick T. Gates, set up the Southern Education Board, which was later incorporated into the General Education Board in 1913, setting in motion the deliberate dumbing down of America. The Country School of Tomorrow, Occasional Papers number 1, written in 1913 in the General Education Board of New York, written by Frederick T. Gates, contained a section entitled A Vision of the Remedy, in which he wrote the following. Is there aught of remedy for this neglect of rural life? Let us at least yield ourselves to the gratifications of a beautiful dream that there is. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or of science. We are not to raise up from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, or whom we now have ample supply. In other words, there's already enough of the ruling class. We just need a bunch of docile dummies to control. And that's exactly what we have. 1914. A resolution was passed by the normal school section of the National Education Association at its annual meeting in St. Paul, Minnesota in the year 1914. And again, you have to think about what underlies that type of thinking. Again, it's people that know that they're ruling over others and they don't want to lose their edge. They don't want competition. They don't want to share their piece of the pie. They just want a nice society of dummies, so they can go out and vote for their hero like Donald Trump, who everyone would see through if they weren't a dumbed-down nation. A resolution was passed by the normal school section of the National Education Association at its annual meeting in St. Paul, Minnesota in the year 1914. An excerpt follows. We view with alarm the activity of the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations, agencies not in any way responsible to the people, in their efforts to control the policies of our state educational institutions, to fashion after their conception and to standardize our courses of study, and to surround the institutions with conditions which menace true academic freedom, and defeat the primary purpose of democracy as heretofore preserved, inviolate in our common schools, normal schools, and universities. 1918. In the January 13th, 1918 issue of New York World, William Boyce Thompson, Federal Reserve Bank Director and founding member of the Council on Foreign Relations, stated that Russia is pointing the way to great and sweeping world changes. It is not in Russia alone that the old order is passing. There is a lot of the old order in America, and that is going too. I'm glad it is so. When I sat and watched those democratic conclaves in Russia, I felt I would welcome a similar scene in the United States. Note, M. Maxine Tremaine of Massachusetts, recognized for her careful research related to international affairs, made the following statements regarding William Boyce Thompson before the National Convention of Women for Constitutional Government in a July 1983 speech. Hey, that's the month I was born. In a July 1983 speech entitled, Russia is the model country of international bankers and industrialists administered by the United Nations headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. Funny what's going on today. William Boyce Thompson personally contributed $1 million to the Russian Revolution. He also arranged for the transfer of money from the United States to the communist revolutionaries. Of course, $1 million back then was billions of dollars today. 1919. The Institute of International Education was founded in 1919 through a grant from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The Institute's purpose was to operate a student exchange program. This process of exchanges grew in concept and practice, with the IIE administering visitor exchange programs for the U.S. Information Agency in the 1990s. The U.S.-Soviet education agreements were negotiated by the Carnegie Endowment's parent organization, the Carnegie Corporation, fostering exchanges of curriculum, pedagogy, and materials as well as students. The Progressive Education Association was founded in 1919 and organized by John Dewey, even though he would not become a member in its early years. PEA's goals and aims were projected by the last half of this century at a board meeting held November 15 through 17, 1943 in Chicago, Illinois. Attendees included Harold Rugg, Marion Carswell, Arthur Gold, Theodore Bremeld, Prudence Bostrick, and Carson Ryan. Speaking of their plans for the period following World War II, the board published a statement in its journal, Progressive Education, Volume 20, number 8, which included the following excerpt. This is a global war, and the peace now in the making will determine what our national life will be for the next century. It will demonstrate the degree of our national morality. We are writing now the credo by which our children must live. Your board unanimously proposes a broadening of the interests and program of the association to include the communities in which our children live. To this end, they propose additions to the governing body to include representatives of welfare services, health, industry, labor, and the professions. In short, a cross-section body to give scope to our program. Yes, something happened around a table in Chicago, an organization which might have become mellowed with the years of futility, in 3 short days again drew a blueprint for children of the world. 1921. In 1921, the League for Industrial Democracy changed its name from the Intercollegiate Socialist Society and stated its purpose as education for a new social order based on production and not for profit. Harold Rugg, writer of social studies textbooks series entitled The Frontier Thinkers, which was published by the Progressive Education Association in 1921, became president of the National Association of Directors of Education Research, which would later become known as the American Educational Research Association. The Council on Foreign Relations was established in 1921 through the efforts of Colonel Edwin Mandell House, confidant extraordinaire to President Woodrow Wilson. Remember, Woodrow Wilson was the first U.S. sitting president to travel to Europe, and they formed the League of Nations, which became the United Nations, and he was the first person to really start this whole globalization thing in America. Woodrow Wilson, and about whom Wilson said, Mr. House is my second personality. His thoughts and mine are one. House was the initiator of the effort to establish the American branch of the English Royal Institute of International Affairs prior. Prior to 1921, House's group, the Inquiry, called the CFR the Institute of International Affairs. In 1912, House had authored Philip Drew, administrator, which promoted Socialism as Dreamed by Karl Marx, about which book Wilson's Secretary of the Interior, Franklin Lane, wrote to a personal friend. All that book is said comes about. The president comes to Philip Drew in the end. Walter Lippmann, member of the Fabian Society and Intercollegiate Socialist Society, was a founding member of the CFR. Again, you guys, this is how George Orwell knew the future, because he was part of the thing that was planning it. Whitney Shepherdson was a director of the CFR from 1921 until 1966. Shepherdson had been an assistant to Colonel House in the 1918 peace conference following World War I and served as secretary of the League of Nations Committee. Shepherdson later became a director of the Carnegie Corporation British and Colonies Fund. Other early CFR members included Charles E. Bowen, first secretary to the American Embassy in Moscow during World War II, and President Franklin Roosevelt's interpreter for his meeting with Joseph Stalin at the Tehran Conference. Frank Idlet, a trustee of the Carnegie Foundation, president of Swarthmore College, American secretary to the Cecil Rhodes Trustees of the Rhodes Scholarship Fund, and director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who initiated George Bush into Skull and Bones, and whose special consultant Bernadette Schmidt had also been a special advisor to Alger Hiss when he had served as Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on International Organizations in San Francisco in 1945, and William Paley, founder of the Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, whose chief advisor was Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew who wrote Propaganda, in which Bernays reveals, those who manipulate the organized habits and opinions of the masses constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of the country. This segment sponsored by Pfizer. It remains a fact in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct, of our ethical thinking, we are dominated by this relatively small number of persons. As civilization has become more complex, and as the need for invisible government has been increasingly demonstrated, the technical means have been invented and developed by which opinion may be regimented. Man, this book sounds like it's a bunch of conspiracy theories. The late Professor Carroll Quigley of Georgetown University described the CFR as a front for J.P. Morgan and company in association with the very small American Roundtable Group. Remember what a lucky guy J.P. was? He had the sniffles, so he got off the Titanic just in time while the world's three richest men who all opposed the Federal Reserve went on the boat and died. Just another big coincidence. Quigley further commented, the board of the CFR have carried ever since the marks of their origin. There grew up in the 20th century a power structure between London and New York, which penetrated deeply into university life, the press, and the practice of foreign policy. The American branch of this English establishment exerted much of its influence through 5 American newspapers: New York Times, New York Herald Tribune, Christian Science Monitor, Washington Post, and the late lamented Boston Evening Transcript. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. penned a tome entitled 1,000 Days in 1965, in which he wrote that the New York financial and legal community was the heart of the American establishment. Its front organization was the Rockefeller, Ford, and Carnegie Foundations and the Council on Foreign Relations. In 1925, Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, or the Scopes Monkey Trial, took place in Dayton, Tennessee. This trial was an important educational milestone regarding the teaching of the theory of evolution in public schools. Scopes pitted 2 famous barristers of the day, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, against each other. The basic argument of the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and the evolutionists was that evolutionary theory should not be censored from the public schools. After this trial, Fabian socialist and first head of UNESCO, Sir Julian Huxley, claimed that humanism's keynote, the central concept to which all its details are related, is evolution. Note, Huxley could have continued by predicting that educational and training methods in the future would be based on the theory of evolution, that man is an animal to be trained as Pavlov, Thorndike, and Skinner trained animals, as with outcome-based education, mastery learning, and direct instructions. 1928. A deliberate math dumb-down was seriously discussed in 1928. A teacher named O.A. Nelson, John Dewey, Edward Thorndike, who conducted early behavioral psychology experiments with chickens, and other Council on Foreign Relations members attended a Progressive Education Association meeting in 1928 at which O.A. Nelson was informed that the purpose of new math was to dumb down students. And of course, when you have a bunch of financial tycoons, why would you want a population that can't do math? Oh, because then they're easily taken advantage of by the banks. Did you guys notice that interest rates are sky high? And you have to pay a lot if you have debt? But is that interest helping you out in your bank account? Oh, you're still making 1 penny a month in interest, huh? Meanwhile, your bill has quadrupled. Okay. It's all starting to make more and more sense. In 1988, at which O.A. Nelson was informed that the purpose of new math was to dumb down students, Nelson revealed in a later interview with Young Parents Alert that the Progressive Education Association was a communist front, according to the National Educator. Mr. O.A. Nelson, retired educator, has supplied the vitally important documentation needed to support the link-up between the textbooks and the Council on Foreign Relations. His letter was first printed in Young Parents Alert, Lake Elmo, Minnesota. His story is self-explanatory. He writes, I know from personal experience that what I'm talking about. In December 1928, I was asked to talk to the American Association for the Advancement of Science. On December 27th, naive and inexperienced, I agreed. I had done some special work in teaching functional physics in high school. That was to be my topic. The next day, the 28th, a Dr. Ziegler asked me if I would attend a special educational meeting in his room after the AAAS meeting. We met from 10 o'clock p.m. until after 2:30 a.m. We were 13 at the meeting. Two things caused Dr. Ziegler, who was chairman of the educational community of the Council on Foreign Relations, to ask me to attend. My talk on the teaching of functional physics in high school, and the fact that I was a member of a group known as the Progressive Education of America, which was nothing but a communist front. I thought the word progressive meant progressive for better schools. 11 of those attending the meeting were leaders in education. Doctors John Dewey and Edward Thorndike from Columbia University were there, and the others were of equal rank. I checked later and found that all were paid members of the Communist Party of Russia. I was classified as a member of the party, but I did not know it at the time. The sole work of the group was to destroy our schools. We spent 1 hour and 45 minutes discussing the so-called modern math. At one point, I objected because there was too much memory work, and math is reasoning, not memory. Dr. Ziegler turned to me and said, Nelson, wake up. This is what we want, a math that the pupils cannot apply to life situations when they get out of school. And I noticed that a long time ago. What we learn in school, it's not very applicable to our lives. And I mean, that should tell you everything you need to know right now about our school system. You know? Everything you should learn should be applicable to your life. Otherwise, what's the point of learning it? And when I taught, I always made a good job to take the BS lessons in the lesson plan and try and show some relevance of how they connected to the real world. Sometimes you couldn't do it. Sometimes it doesn't. You know what, you guys? This is part of the curriculum. And remember, there's also something about developing a work ethic. You know, sometimes you got to do things you don't want to do. And if you learn to do that, that can help you out later in life too. That math was not introduced until much later, as those present thought it was too radical of a change. A milder course by Dr. Breckner was substituted, but it was also worthless, as far as understanding math was concerned. The radical change was introduced in 1952. That's the year my mom was born, and she is absolutely god-awful at math. God. It was the one we are using now. So if pupils come out of high school now not knowing any math, don't blame them. The results are supposed to be worthless. Okay, so we've read through chapter 2, chapter 3. Who put this abridged version together? Chapter 3 begins on page 33, the troubling 30s. We will read it later. I got to call my dad right now, though. Chapter 4 is about the 40s and 50s. We'll work through this entire book, you guys. That way, if you don't have a library that has a copy and you don't want to spend $250 on what the book now goes for, you can hear it all here. So we'll read it piece by piece. Chapter 3 later. Thank you to the super chatter in the beginning who chipped in $5. I do appreciate that. And let me see if I can scroll all the way back to his super chat to thank him for whoever did that. I saw somebody's comment with all the flames that says, how do we fix these problems? Again, I mean, we got to wake up our fellow man. Until we wake up our fellow man, I don't see anything changing. So, all right. Well, it looks like it's too far back. Thank you to the person who donated the $5, though. I appreciate it. So, all right, Truth Seeker, we'll leave it there. And probably do another live stream tonight. Shout out to Cousin Mar, who pounded pavement with us in New York. He wants to come on and tell a personal story about how Gematria has changed his life. He was homeless when he found the work. And he found a way to put some cash in his pocket, and he's flipped it all around since there. So, again, for all the trolls out there who say, never sign up, Zach's a fraud, just realize those are the frauds lying to you. This work's helped turn around a lot of people's lives in all sorts of ways. And should be on later tonight with Cousin Mar. All right, Truth Seeker. Till next time.